For a long time, the Iraqi dinar has occupied an unusual space in financial discussions. It has never been completely dismissed, yet it has never fully delivered on the expectations built around it. It always seems close to a turning point, but that turning point never quite arrives. That tension is exactly why this conversation matters today. Not because of a single headline or the latest rumor circulating online, but because this moment gives us a chance to step back and understand how currency narratives are created, why they keep repeating, and where the underlying reality actually sits beneath all the noise. One detail that often gets overlooked is how dramatically perception can shift when a story becomes linked to a large global financial institution. When claims surface that involve a major international bank with extensive regulatory oversight and global reach, it immediately changes how people feel about the situation even before any new facts are confirmed. That emotional reaction can be powerful, but it can also be misleading if it isn't examined carefully. Instead of asking whether a specific claim is true or false, a more useful question is why these stories are resurfacing now and what would actually need to be true within the real financial system for such developments to have meaningful impact. To understand that, it helps to zoom out. The Iraqi dinar has been operating under various forms of constraint for decades. Conflict, sanctions, political instability, reliance on oil revenues, and capital controls have all shaped how the currency functions. This is not a typical emerging market currency story. It is the case of a post-conflict monetary system still working to rebuild credibility as much as value. That distinction is critical because currencies do not reprice in isolation. They change when the systems around them change, including banking access, settlement infrastructure, trade mechanisms, reserve management, and institutional trust. This is where many discussions around the dinar lose focus. Too much attention is placed on the exchange rate itself, while the structural foundations beneath it are ignored. When people hear claims about banks preparing or approvals being granted, what that usually indicates, if it indicates anything at all, is not a secret overnight adjustment in value. More often, it points to operational readiness. That includes compliance planning, system compatibility, regulatory alignment, and scenario testing. Large financial institutions do not approach currencies the way individual traders do. They prepare for a wide range of outcomes long before any policy shift becomes public. That kind of preparation is not confirmation of change, but it also isn't meaningless. This is where the story becomes relevant from a market perspective. Iraq has been under steady pressure from international institutions to modernize its financial framework. This includes strengthening anti-money laundering standards, expanding digital payment systems, reducing reliance on informal dollar channels, and tightening central bank oversight. These are not talking points aimed at currency holders. They are institutional requirements discussed at the level of global financial organizations. When Iraq adjusts its currency auctions, modifies access to dollars, or tests new settlement processes, those are actions that matter for currency credibility. They are not revaluations, but they are prerequisites for any long-term normalization. This stands in contrast to the way many people imagine currency change. The common assumption is that a revaluation happens suddenly, like a switch being flipped. In reality, it tends to look more like pressure slowly building within a system until policymakers believe they can manage the consequences of adjustment. For Iraq to allow its currency to strengthen in a meaningful way, several conditions would need to be in place at the same time. Oil revenues would need to be managed predictably. The banking system would need to function effectively as an intermediary. Authorities would need confidence that capital flight would not spiral out of control. These are not minor hurdles, and they explain why timelines are often misunderstood. When someone says change is coming soon, that usually reflects anticipation, not authorization. Financial institutions anticipate constantly. Governments authorize cautiously and often quietly. There is also a broader global context that matters. Conversations around the dinar tend to intensify during periods of global monetary transition. When the US dollar tightens, when liquidity becomes more selective, and when emerging markets are forced to clean up balance sheets, attention naturally turns to constrained or vulnerable currencies. Right now, the global environment is one where capital is more cautious and currencies are scrutinized more closely than they were several years ago. In that setting, countries like Iraq are incentivized to project stability even if full normalization is still some distance away. That context is often missing from popular discussions. So when claims circulate about banks preparing for changes related to the dinar, it is often because systems are being tested under multiple scenarios, not because a dramatic event is imminent. Regulators expect institutions to be ready for a range of outcomes. That reality does not invalidate interest in the dinar, but it does make the story far more complex than it is usually presented. And complexity is where serious analysis belongs. It also helps to think about incentives. Who benefits from Iraq gradually strengthening its currency credibility? Domestic importers, government finances, and long-term investors tend to benefit from stability and predictability. Who loses? Short-term speculators, black market intermediaries, and systems built around arbitrage rather than productivity. This is why any genuine evolution of the currency would likely be slow, managed, and intentionally uneventful. Markets may crave excitement, but policymakers usually aim for control. That tension between market narratives and institutional reality is why these stories keep resurfacing. A balanced approach for anyone watching this space is neither blind enthusiasm nor outright dismissal. It is calibration. Paying attention to policy instead of promises. Watching banking reforms rather than leaks. Focusing on settlement rules rather than imagined rates. If the dinar's role were to change in a meaningful way, it would not be announced first through rumors. It would become visible through constraints being lifted and procedures being adjusted. And when that happens, it is unlikely to feel dramatic. It will feel administrative, even boring. That is often how real financial change begins. There is another dimension that rarely gets discussed, and it becomes relevant once a currency gains credibility, not just nominal value. This brings us to the idea of global tradability, a term that is often used but rarely explained. On the surface, it sounds straightforward. In practice, tradability is a permission structure. For a currency to circulate freely internationally, global banks must be willing to clear it. Correspondent relationships must be active, settlement risks must be manageable, and regulators must be confident the currency is not being used to bypass controls. Many currencies technically exist but remain functionally limited for these reasons. The Iraqi dinar sits in this gray zone. It is widely used domestically, but internationally it remains constrained. That is not the result of hidden agendas, but of risk management. When banks prepare for potential changes related to such a currency, they are usually engaging in internal scenario analysis. They ask what would happen if capital controls were loosened, if settlement frameworks changed, or if the central bank adjusted its operating model. Preparing for those possibilities does not mean they are guaranteed. It means institutions want to avoid being unprepared if policy shifts occur. Viewed through this lens, the real question is not whether the dinar will suddenly rise in value, but whether Iraq is positioning itself to slowly re-enter more normal financial circulation. That path is longer and less dramatic, but also far more realistic. It must also be understood within the structure of Iraq's economy, which remains heavily dependent on oil. When oil prices are high, foreign currency inflows increase. When prices fall, pressure returns quickly. A stronger currency can sound appealing, but without economic diversification, it can undermine competitiveness. This is why central banks in resource-dependent economies move carefully. Move too fast and exports suffer. Move too slowly and inflation erodes trust. This is not speculation. It is the everyday reality of central banking. Many narratives fail because they assume a single objective, usually framed as raising the currency's value. In practice, the real objective is control. Control over inflation, capital flows, and confidence. Once that is understood, the discussion becomes less emotional and more analytical. Risk also deserves attention. Periods of monetary transition often bring volatility, not always in headline exchange rates, but in access, pricing spreads, and policy signals. Early phases tend to reward clarity rather than impatience. Mispricing can occur. Rumors can multiply. Opportunistic behavior can increase. This pattern has been seen across regions from Eastern Europe to Asia and Latin America. The loudest voices usually appear first, while the clearest signals emerge last. That is why patience is not just emotional discipline, but analytical discipline. Timing relative to global cycles matters as well. We are no longer in an era of easy global money. Central banks worldwide have become more conservative. That makes large-scale currency shifts harder, not easier. Progress is still possible, but it unfolds under tighter scrutiny. From a policymaker's perspective, a dramatic announcement would risk destabilizing expectations. Gradual framework adjustments and reduced distortions are far more consistent with historical precedent. So the real forward-looking question is not when, but how. How would a genuine shift first show up? Not through whispers or leaks, but through incremental changes. Adjustments to settlement rules, refinements to auction mechanisms, clearer cross-border payment regulations, and improved transparency from the central bank. These are the signals that matter. Everything else remains noise until supported by policy. The persistence of these conversations is still meaningful. It suggests Iraq's currency is no longer ignored. Expectations exist even if they are often poorly framed. That alone marks a change from where things stood a decade ago. But expectations also carry risk, especially when they run ahead of reality. There is a psychological side to this story that cannot be ignored. In markets, expectation risk can be more destabilizing than price movement itself. When people become anchored to a specific outcome tied to timing or life-changing impact, objective analysis fades. Delays are reinterpreted. Contradictions are dismissed. This pattern has appeared in technology bubbles, commodity cycles, digital asset narratives, and sovereign debt crises. The longer an expectation persists, the harder it becomes to recalibrate. If change comes gradually and without spectacle, many may fail to recognize it. They may wait for dramatic confirmation that never arrives. Yet that is often how genuine monetary change looks at first, subtle and underwhelming. When expectations race ahead of policy, the impact shows up in decisions rather than prices. People concentrate risk, delay diversification, and overlook opportunity costs. A disciplined observer does the opposite, asking what conditions would need to exist, what signals would challenge their assumptions, and what partial progress might realistically look like. Bringing this back to Iraq, the country continues to navigate political fragmentation, infrastructure challenges, and external dependencies. Any currency reform must operate within those constraints. Progress would likely include pauses, adjustments, and contradictions. That is not failure, it is governance under pressure. Even without dramatic shifts in value, incremental improvements in credibility can still matter. More predictable imports, reduced reliance on parallel markets, and lower inflation volatility are meaningful outcomes, even if they do not generate headlines. Preparation in this context is often misunderstood. It is not about committing to a single outcome or waiting for one defining event. Real preparation means maintaining flexibility, understanding access, regulatory boundaries, transaction mechanics, and potential scenarios. When narratives promise certainty, they eliminate that flexibility. When analysis emphasizes uncertainty, it preserves it. That is why serious institutions communicate carefully. Their priority is resilience, not excitement. So when claims of confirmation or preparation surface, the most responsible response is context. Who is making the claim, in what capacity, and against what institutional backdrop? Those questions do not end the discussion. They clarify it. Right now, the shape of this story suggests something important but understated. Iraq remains on a long path toward normalization, and interest in that process is growing. Some signals are genuine, others exaggerated, and some misunderstood. The challenge lies in distinguishing between them. For anyone following this space, the most valuable approach is not waiting for announcements, but refining how the story is evaluated. Focus on mechanisms instead of milestones, signals instead of slogans, process instead of payoff. Because when real shifts occur in global finance, they rarely arrive with fanfare. They reveal themselves quietly through policy alignment, institutional behavior, and sustained consistency. When that moment comes, those who understand the system will recognize it immediately. Everyone else will still be waiting for the headline.